1923. Rosewood, Florida. Pine air sharp with winter cold. In the span of a single week, a prosperous black town will be hunted, burned, and then quietly removed from the official story, erased from state maps and schoolrooms as if it had never stood. What follows is macabre, unspeakable, and for decades effectively banned from public memory. This is not rumor. This is a case file, allegations multiplied by headlines. Mobs moving under the banner of order, families taking back trails with children pressed to their coats, documents later classified by neglect rather than law. We will not show graphic images. We will show evidence maps, minutes, affidavits, survivor accounts, and let the record speak. Stay with this chapter, and you will see how a single accusation detonated a system already wired to explode, how the machinery of forgetting can feel more permanent than flame. If your family holds even a scrap of this story, names, dates, places, do not let it disappear again. Write it down. Say it out loud. Share it below so the archive grows, where silence once lived. Before the firelight, there was ordinary light. Sunday shoes dusted for church, a piano polished for evening hymns, a schoolroom with slates lined in chalk, gardens staked neatly behind wood fences, a store where accounts were kept by handshake and memory. In Rosewood, black families, carrier Bradley Robinson and others, stitched livelihood from turpentine and timber, from steady wages, and small enterprises from trust traded across porches and pews. The soundscape was familiar saws at the mill, the low whistle of a distant train, the creak of a screen door in winter air. It looked like a haven, because it was one built under Jim Crow, yes, but still a haven. Prosperity signaled independence. Independence sounded like defiance to those guarding the racial order. The very proofs of success, land deeds, a piano, a well-stocked pantry, registered as threats in a system that punished black stability as provocation. Beneath the pine needles lay tinder decades of cast rumor and warnings passed off as law. Everyone felt the tension without naming it. A brakeman said the woods felt wrong that week. An elder told the children to keep close after sunset. Whether you call these omens or just the survival math of the South, they formed a final warning that would be understood only after the houses were ash. Rosewood's normal was beautiful and brittle. A town can hold birthdays and burdens at once. It can produce hymnals and fear in the same breath. That's the truth the maps would later refuse, not just that a community existed, but that it flourished. And flourishing under Jim Crow was treated like a dare. The next steps in this story show what happens when rumor is treated as evidence, when the badge looks away, and when neighbors decide that peace requires someone else's absence. If anything in your family history echoes this. If a grandparent once said, "We had to leave in the night," add what you know in the comments, however small. Names become anchors. Places become coordinates. Fragments become a record no one can erase. To see why Rosewood could be targeted at all, widen the frame to Florida in the early 1920s, where statutes and custom braided into a rope that looked like law. Jim Crow did not simply segregate train cars and schoolhouses. It standardized what counted as credible fear and who counted as a threat. County courts ran on calendars, but also on unwritten hierarchies. Sheriffs wore badges backed by budgets, but also by the tacit permission of neighbors who expected order to defend whiteness first. The convict lease era had left a paper trail of labor controlled by punishment and profit. Even when the leases faded, the premise persisted: the state could extract from black life without returning protection. Newspapers moved in lockstep, with rumor printing accusations as if they were indictments, then letting the retraction, if any, die on page 6. In Levy County, timber framed the economy. Turpentine camps, sawmills, and railheads bound the pine woods to the market. Black laborers cut, tapped, hauled, and loaded. White managers counted, shipped, insured, and litigated. When wages thinned or prices dipped, anxiety searched for a host. The easiest host was a story, a whisper, that became a headline that recruited a posse. Public safety was the refrain repeated until it sounded like common sense. But the math behind that refrain was tilted safety for some, surveillance for others. Peace that required one side to be unarmed and the other unchallenged. Lynching statistics from the previous decade taught a lesson. Too many officials accepted if no grand jury returned a true bill. The mob's version of events might stand as the last word. Deputies learned to maintain proximity without intervention, riding alongside men with shotguns while narrating their presence as restraint. Inquests could be convened and concluded in hours. Causes of death could be recorded with euphemisms that made terror sound like weather. A coroner's ledger could shrink a life into a line. Insurance companies studied acts of riot clauses to decline claims. Titles languished when owners fled. Paper did not burn as quickly as houses, but paper could erase just as thoroughly. Education. What children read and recited also carried the load. County readers praised pioneer courage and civic order while leaving neighborhoods like Rosewood unnamed, unclaimed, undefined. What is left out is as instructive as what is included. A map that labels a river and a railway, but not the community between them, begins the work of forgetting long before the fire does. When a generation was taught a civic story with no room for the people next door, the ground was prepared for the unspeakable to arrive as if it were inevitable. So when on a New Year's morning in 1923, a white woman in Sumner reported an assault, the machinery already knew its cues. The alleged assailant was described in elastic ways, dark, tall, unknown descriptions designed to fit whomever the mob wished to see. Officers gathered statements, but not doubts. Men left mills and porches with rifles and certainty. The house-to-house search read like a warrant served on a community rather than a person. The vocabulary of procedure questioning, escorting, securing, masked a reality of intimidation. A sheriff's assurance that he would keep the peace functioned as a portable permission slip for those eager to test the edge of that phrase. It is important to note that not all white residents agreed. Some counseled restraint. Some hid children behind flour barrels and beneath wagon tarps. But the structure of the moment punished dissent and rewarded aggression. The men loudest in the lane tended to drown out the few who asked, "What if we're wrong?" Fear privatized conscience. Public space was given over to performance. The posse became its own audience, and the show it demanded was swift, punitive, and spectacular. Meanwhile, black homeowners in and around Rosewood performed a different calculus. They knew the precedents. They knew families in other counties who had packed on a night's notice because an accusation elsewhere had bled across miles like spilled turpentine through sand. They knew that calling for help could summon the very men they feared. Some kept firearms not as rebellion, but as ritual tools of last resort in a landscape where the law's arrival did not guarantee the law's protection. Still, they also knew that any defense would be named an offense. This is how a system programs an outcome: build rules that criminalize survival, then invoke those rules to justify the blow. The press amplified the script in real time. Within hours, lines appeared in columns. Negro suspect posse forms. Search expands. Conditional verbs hardened into past tense without evidence. Rumors were granted the dignity of quotation marks. Corrections rarely matched the size of the original claim. When a paper said community restored to calm, what it often meant was the quiet after a storm, the kind of calm one finds in ashes at dawn. Editors were not judges, but in places where readers treated headlines as verdicts they might as well have been. This context matters because it explains the velocity with which a single accusation crossed a county line and entered the homes of people who had nothing to do with it. It explains the asymmetry of arms and authority on a January night when a house full of children was told to crouch. It explains why a deputy's wagon could pass a knot of armed men without halting them, then arrive at a black doorstep to demand compliance in the name of statute. In this ledger power wrote both sides of the equation. There were two, the smaller instruments of policy that accumulate force, a licensing rule here, a voter purge there, a road crew that graded a lane past one settlement and not another. Infrastructure is ideology made durable. When the time came to flee the same design-shaped options, which homes had wagons ready, which paths were passable after rain, which families knew the night schedule of the local freight. Survival favored those with unspectacular knowledge, not tying water reading, the memory of two trees that lean toward each other like a gate. It should not require such skills to remain a citizen. In 1923, it often did. Folk memory remembers what documents ignore. In the weeks leading to the first day of that year, people recalled small disturbances that refused to resolve. Dogs barked at empty forks in the road. A pine snapped in a still morning as if pressed by a hand. A brakeman with 20 seasons on the line said he did not like the feel of the woods. The rails sounded hollow, he said, like someone far ahead was already leaving. A church elder advised families to keep the littlest children close after sundown, no reason given, none needed. Women stacked kindling in tighter bundles as if speed might soon matter more than warmth. Men checked hinges twice and kept lanterns topped and trimmed. Call these omens, or call them the practiced vigilance of people who had learned to read a county's weather where no forecast was printed. There is a kind of premonition that does not promise escape so much as clarity. You do not know exactly what will happen, only that the ground has shifted underfoot. A rumor passes through a doorway at noon, and somehow by supper the room itself feels smaller. The air in a town can change tone the way a hymn sung in a lower register sounds both the same and not. This is what a final warning feels like, before anyone names it, a tightening, a shrinking of choices, a subtle rearrangement of ordinary tasks around the possibility of flight. People spoke about dreams only after the fact, because hindsight invites pattern. One woman said she had dreamt of a map with the town's name smudged to a gray blur. Another said she saw a line of children moving between tall trees without footprints, as if the ground had hardened ahead of them and softened behind. Whether those stories were visions or later arrangements of grief, they testify to a truth. The records cannot hold alone. A community's intuition can be as exact as its census. Everyone sensed that an old script often rehearsed elsewhere was about to be performed here. And still in the days before the first shot, life preceded work whistles, church bells, frying pans, letters written in slanted hands. The dignity of the ordinary persisted even as the extraordinary advanced. That is the contrast the macabre always exploits you. Set the table because that is what a home requires. The rumor sets a different table and calls it justice. When the moment arrives, one table is overturned and the other is served. By the time the official record begins, by the time dates and names and distances appear in minutes and affidavits, the outcome will already be moving from possibility to practice. Understanding these layers, statute and custom press and rumor infrastructure and intuition does not absolve anyone. It clarifies responsibility. Rosewood did not stumble into tragedy. It was placed in a system where a spark could travel farther than water, where the vocabulary of law could be used to unhouse the lawful, where maps could be trimmed until a community looked like empty county. This is how a town becomes vulnerable long before a match is struck. This is how forgetting begins while memory is still alive. If your own family learned to read such weather, if a grandparent saved a road in their head or a name on a loose scrap of paper, know that these fragments matter. They are not just keepsakes. They are countermaps. In a world where some histories were labeled banned by silence, the smallest remembered path is a line back to the truth. The first crack of gunfire did not arrive with warning sirens or official statements. It arrived like a decision that had already been made. Men from Sumner spilled down the road with a purpose that outpaced facts, voices pitched to prove themselves to one another. Rifles held the way certainty is held when it has not been tested. A name was demanded, then another. Doors that had never needed bolts were forced to answer for a crime miles away. Inside one house, children were told to get low to keep their eyes on the baseboards, to listen only to their mother's breath and the counting she whispered to steady her own hands. Outside the vocabulary of procedure, secure question escort slipped its mask. It was not a search. It was a performance of guilt assigned in advance. The first man to fall did so in confusion, a tangle of shouted orders and poor light and fear ricocheting off walls that had been painted for Sundays, not sieges. A woman who had taught children to sound out hymns lay still where she had ordered them to be still. Those details would later be filed as if they could be squared by a coroner's line. But in the room, it was simpler, and worse, the unthinkable had been made thinkable by repetition elsewhere. And now, repetition had come here. Word of the exchange moved faster than anyone could walk. It moved by rumor, and then by wagon, by telephone where a line existed, by locomotive where a timetable could be persuaded to yield a favor. Crowds beget crowds. The second wave arrived larger than the first, and with each arrival, the premise hardened. This was no longer a matter of who had done what in Sumner. It was a matter of what could be done to Rosewood. Officials appeared, but not as a wall. A deputy spoke of keeping the peace and began by relieving black men of the guns they kept for storms and snakes and nights like this that were not supposed to come. White men arrived with more guns than they had names for. An officer told a family to clear their home for safety and took down no inventory of what was left behind. The law was present at the edges, not at the hinge where force tilted. When a man with a badge advises you to leave but does not order your pursuers to stop, the geometry of protection is solved in an instant. Many understood that calculation without needing it explained. House by house. The questions ran: who lived here? How long? Who visited last night? The answers, which had always been sufficient to live by our names, our kin. Our work no longer matched the test. Doors that opened onto hallways now opened onto accusations. Windows that held winter light now framed silhouettes men claimed to fear. The children learned a new posture for the same floorboards. Some families bolted into the hammocks and low swales behind their homes where scrub and pine and palmetto could conceal a line of people if they moved crouched and slow. Mothers memorized the order of small bodies by feel. Fathers counted steps toward creeks they had fished and turned those creeks into boundaries no one dared cross at night. Not every neighbor chose the mob. There were men who said, enough men who drove wagons without questions. Women who pushed bread and canteens into hands they had known since christenings. But mercy had to move in shadow because the show of force brooked no critique. To interfere invited the accusation of treason against the very order the posse claimed to defend. In daylight, relief wore a uniform. At night, relief wore no name at all. By the third day, fire served as both weapon and semaphore. A roofline lit the horizon and drew men who said they had come to help, though none carried buckets. The work of decades collapsed in minutes, a cedar chest split by heat, a certificate curled into a black ribbon. A piano's strings snapped in a series of small, terrible notes that would not show up on any official list. The mob read each blaze as confirmation that it was right to be there, proof conjured from destruction. The county read the same blaze as disturbance, a word that keeps its distance from responsibility. Escape followed geography as much as courage. The rail corridor, once a promise that goods and people could move in daylight, became a thin, dangerous hope at night. Conductors were not judges, but some judged anyway. A lantern dipped twice on a siding when it should have dipped once. A signal to climb quickly into the last car if you were willing to ride between crates. Elsewhere, men with rifles watched those same sidings and took down numbers that would never become warrants. A road that ran straight was a road to avoid. A path that doubled back through sawgrass might stretch a quarter-mile into hours. But it ended in a neighbor's yard with a gate that opened without a creak because somebody had oiled it for years for just this reason. The betrayals compounded. A man who had paid premiums was told his policy did not cover riot. A petitioner was informed that the office to receive his claim had moved, though no one could say where. A teacher returned to the schoolroom to rescue ledgers and found the cupboard pried and the pages scattered, attendance ending mid-week, as if children had simply forgotten to exist. The language of governance forms stamps minutes prove flexible where it needed to be inflexible and inflexible where it should have bent toward mercy. A magistrate scheduled an inquest at a time no black witness could safely travel. A warning to disperse was delivered to the only people already trying to leave. By the week's end, the map had begun its second life. First, life coordinates and creeks and a cluster of homes labeled with a name. Second life, the same coordinates and creeks, fewer homes. The label omitted as if it had been a printing error, corrected in a new edition. Cartography is never neutral. Someone decided that what had been present could be made absent by ink. Someone else would later point to that absence as proof that there had never been very much there to begin with. This is how a town is injured twice, once by flame, and again by a line that does not carry its name. People told pieces of the truth while the smoke still hung. A boy recited the order of houses. He had passed the white one with the porch, the low one with the two windows, the one with the crooked stump. Because he could not memorize pain, but he could memorize direction. A woman retrieved a keepsake and wrapped it in a shirt, because she believed paper might still count if anyone ever asked her to prove she had belonged to where she belonged. A man wrote down on the back of a grocery bill the time a deputized neighbor had aimed his barrel at a door frame and fired, not because he thought the note itself would hold up in court, but because he understood that dates and times can resist erasure if they are stubborn enough. And yet, when the inquiries began to be proposed, not convened, proposed, the shape of the official record grew narrow. Statements were taken from those easiest to find and least at risk for giving them. People who had fled were called absent, and their absence was used to diminish their claims. The contradiction was elegant and cruel. The danger that forced them away made their testimony suspect, and the very flight that preserved their lives was cited as weakness in their case. The state is capable of this kind of geometry when it prefers a result. In quieter rooms, the inside stories accumulated. A nurse who had set a bandage on a child burned by a lantern asked whether anyone needed her to write what she saw, and was told the matter would settle itself. A conductor kept a list of passengers who boarded with no trunks and no tickets, just cash and fear. He placed the paper behind a panel because he did not know which supervisor would read it in which spirit. A mail clerk noticed that letters with rosewood in the corner stopped a small silence in a pile of envelopes that had once been steady. He could prove the stoppage, not the reason. There were rumors of a ledger, a notebook kept by a local figure who fancied himself a manager of events. The notebook allegedly named who rode out at night and which lanes they favored. No one could produce it. Perhaps it never existed. Perhaps it was burned by the one man cautious enough to record and then smart enough to destroy. In a way, the question misses the point. The outcome did not require a ledger. It required only a pattern, and the pattern was visible in daylight officials who knew which way to look, papers that moved when they needed to, and memories that were asked to be quiet in the name of getting on with things. A few testimonies survived in odd places. Unlikely boxes in county basements, notes jotted in margins, affidavits that never made the docket. They do not form a straight line. They form a constellation. A grocer who counted fewer loaves sold because there were fewer mouths. A teacher who wrote next to a child's name relocated, and then after the child did not return by spring unknown. A preacher who noted that the Wednesday service had been canceled on account of weather, though everyone in that town understood that the weather was men. These fragments are not dramatic. They are exact. They hold dates that can be matched to train schedules and moonrise tables and the minutes of meetings where nothing was said because the quiet was policy. When later generations came asking, when legislators and reporters and students tried to rebuild the week that unmade a town, they found this a public record, thin by design, and a private record thick with memory that had been taught to distrust itself. Survivors were told their recollections were colored by time, as if time had not been colored against them first. The burden of proof shifted from those who had set fires to those who had fled them. It is a familiar trick in the history of banned truths demand a standard of evidence. No one meets easily, then use the failure as pretext to close the case. What remains, finally, is the clarity that comes from pattern recognition. A single accusation in Sumner became a campaign in Rosewood, because the pathways existed legal, cultural, logistical, for rumor to dress as law. The betrayal was not only in a deputy's shrug or a magistrate's calendar. It was in the infrastructure of forgetting that waited with open arms. And yet, against that machinery, testimonies continued spoken at kitchen tables, folded into letters, told softly to grandchildren in rooms far from Florida. Each one is a small defiance of erasure, an affidavit against the idea that the absence of a name on a map is the end of a story. If you have ever held a family detail that felt too small to matter, a date, a creek name, a surname said with care, understand how large it is in a landscape built to lose such things. This is how a record grows back not in one grand document, but in the steady addition of exactness that refuses to be silent. Fire leaves illegible aftermath angles, where roof lines once met iron, that survives what wood cannot, circles of scorched soil where heat pooled and then withdrew. Investigators, official or informal, can read such sites like palimpsests. In the days after the last blaze dimmed, the evidence sat in plain air wells, silted and fouled, fence lines cut through with deliberate haste, cedar chests popped like seeds in a kiln. Any inventory must stay within ethical bounds. No spectacle, no dwelling on injuries as imagery. But the material record is enough to speak. A piano's harp plate too heavy to carry off cooled amid ash. Its broken strings marked a clock no ledger kept. Charred joists sketched floor plans where bedrooms had been. The school's cupboard's pride then left shed pages that ended mid-week, the handwriting tilting, as if the writer had started to hurry and then had to stop. These are the macabre details that do not require a single graphic frame, the geometry of absence. Numbers diverged immediately, as they usually do when power prefers ambiguity. Official tallies narrowed quickly to the smallest count that could still be called a count. Private memory held more names, some spoken only within families, because to insist publicly might invite retaliation anew. The gruesome truth is not an arithmetic trick. It is a pattern in the paper. Inquests were brief. Causes of death wore euphemisms in the course of a disturbance struck by unknown fire phrases that treat violence as weather. Grand juries convened and concluded with a speed that suggested fatigue rather than hunger for fact. Insurance adjusters arrived with clipboards and phrases like riot exemption, leaving behind letters that made ruin sound like a clause. Claims for property, land, tools, household goods met walls of procedure taller than the houses that had stood. What could be salvaged was both humble and enormous, a family Bible with singed edges. A photograph spotted by heat into constellations. A set of keys now unlocking nothing. A tin of buttons saved for garments that would never be sewn in that place again. One mother carried a child on her hip and a jar of coins in the other hand. Later, she would say she had chosen the jar not for money, but for noise. The clink was proof she was still here. In a different yard, a man lifted a well bucket and found the water spoiled, the rope blackened. He cut the rope and coiled the remnant as if he might need rope again in a new town. He would. These scenes explain without display how thorough erasure can be when it is both physical and bureaucratic. The documentary record, such as it is, contains artifacts that fix time without need for narration. A railway timetable shows an unscheduled stop. A conductor's pocket notes confirm a lantern dipped twice on a siding that week. Minutes of a county meeting refer to recent disturbances and authorize repairs to a road near the site, repairs that make sense only if heavy wagons had scarred the surface. A church ledger skips to a later date and lists relocated next to several families' names. The next page is blank for months, then resumes with a smaller roster in a different hand. If a camera pans across these documents, while a voice reads their plain language, the viewer understands the extent of the damage, without a single gory image. The story is unspeakable, but it is not unsayable. It can be told by paper and place. The cartographic wound is equally clear. Editions of maps before the winter carry a label for a cluster of homes. Editions after omit it, though the creek bends as it always did and the rail crosses at the same mile. Someone decided an erasure looked like accuracy. This is not an accident at scale. It is a decision at a desk. Later textbooks lifted their topography from those maps and their narratives from the thinnest official summaries. A student could graduate believing the land between two known points had been empty all along. That is how erased becomes a civic outcome, not just a metaphor. To answer why this could happen and why the silence lasted requires following incentive rather than slogan. The first motive is economic. Land without the people who held it becomes cheap and transferable. Titles fragment when owners flee under duress. Contested parcels drift into the hands of those positioned to resolve the paperwork. Hardware, livestock, lumber, anything not burned or carried can be claimed as abandoned or secured as evidence that never finds its way back. The second motive is political. In a system where office holders depend on the approval of the majority population, prosecuting members of that majority for mob action is costly. It is simpler to frame the event as an unfortunate disturbance, promise calm, and move on. The third motive is cultural fear policed through spectacle. A prosperous black town under Jim Crow reads as an argument against the racial order. Its destruction reads as a warning to other communities who might be gathering wealth, dignity, or votes. The performance of dominance is meant to travel farther than the flames. Mechanism matters as much as motive. Records are not merely lost, they are classified by practice, misfiled, misplaced, or thinned by standards applied one way. A complaint can be dismissed for lack of a sworn witness, even when the conditions that produced the complaint also made it deadly to testify. A petition can be rejected for a missing stamp, while the office that sells stamps is closed due to unrest. A hearing can be calendared at an hour that ensures only one side can safely attend. Each step looks procedural. Together they form a conveyor that carries accountability away. The press participates sometimes by appetite, sometimes by inertia. Early headlines shout. Corrective notes whisper. When newspapers adopt the language of officials without independent verification order, restored no further trouble expected, they launder the state's preferred frame as neutral observation. Photographs of ruins are captioned as aftermath rather than crime scene, assigning agency to no one. A reader many counties away receives the impression that violence happened and then ended the way storms happen and end. In such coverage, there is little room for the fact that reconstruction can be prevented by policy, that recovery can be denied by letter, that what is called calm is sometimes only the quiet of people gone. Courts play their part by insisting on exactness in the very places where exactness has been burned. They ask for receipts when receipts are ash. They require names when names have scattered under threat. This is not the rule of law. It is rule by loophole. In rare instances where a suit survives to reach a docket, judges can narrow questions so tightly that even a favorable ruling cannot touch the larger harm. A property line is adjudicated without acknowledging the force that made the line relevant. A death is recorded without the context that made the death likely. The public sees a system functioning. Victims feel a system closing. Education cements the arrangement. Without lesson plans, teachers rely on approved texts. Without texts, they rely on memory, which is precisely what the system has asked to be quiet. Children memorize rivers and capitals and wars, but not the names of neighbors who were once across the tracks. Field trips visit courthouses, not hamlets that no longer stand. A culture learns what it has been taught to notice, and what it has been taught to ignore becomes controversy rather than content. In that environment, to speak of Rosewood for decades was to break a silence many mistook for civility. It is easier to call such stories banned than to admit they were simply unwelcome. And yet mechanisms of resistance persisted alongside mechanisms of forgetting. Families created their own archives, a folded deed carried through 2 moves. A list of births and baptisms annotated with the word left next to a year. A tin box with a key that opens nothing now except a story. Church women wrote minutes in a steady hand even when attendance halved. Deacons kept offering tallies that fell and then climbed again in new towns. A few white neighbors wrote letters to private apologies, public statements that went unpublished, affidavits that entered small files in distant offices. These do not undo the harm. They prove it, and they keep proving it each time they are read. So the revelation at the center of this history is not only that a town burned, it is that a modern state can coordinate forgetting without issuing a single formal decree. It can allow economics to sweep the floor, politics to lock the door, and culture to dim the lights, and then call the darkness natural. Once you see that structure, you can recognize it elsewhere. A blank on a map is rarely a mystery. It is a verdict. The work of a documentary is to reopen the case not with spectacle, not with accusation, untethered to proof, but with enough hard light on paper and place that denial has nowhere to stand. The camera can linger finally not on ruins, but on continuity. The rail still runs, the creek still bends, the pines still lift and shiver. A new generation stands on land that was once labeled empty and says the name out loud. Saying it is not a ritual of grief alone. It is an audit. It charges interest on the debt of silence. It rejects the idea that erasure is an acceptable end to any civic story. And it prepares in the present tense the only honest answer to the question of why this happened and why it was hidden, because power wanted it so, and because power can be taught to want otherwise. When the record refuses to close, the pines still write their thin script against the sky. The rail still cuts its mile with metronomic certainty. What changed was the line on the map and the decision behind it. Rosewood did not vanish by accident. It was made to disappear first by fire, then by paperwork, then by the long quiet of classrooms that never spoke its name. Yet a record survived in stubborn places, a ledger with a blank week, a timetable with a lantern dipped twice, a family Bible that smells faintly of smoke. These fragments are not souvenirs. They are receipts. Justice, when it came at all, arrived late and partial, carrying both apology and absence. But even late truth has a job to cancel the lie that silence is neutral. The point of telling this now is not to salt the wound. It is to close the ledger honestly. Erasure is policy only if we agree to it. Maps can be redrawn. Curricula can be revised. Public memory can be repaired by naming what power once preferred to forget. So we end where we began, on a winter road in Florida. But the camera does not linger on ash. It holds on faces survivors whose voices thinned with age. Descendants who say the word Rosewood like a key, turning neighbors who choose witness over comfort. Say the name and the blank space shrinks. Teach the weak and the rumor loses its authority. Hold the paper to the light and the watermark appears. If your family carries a data creek, a surname offer it, and the archive grows. If your town keeps a silence, break it with care and with proof. History does not ask us to be perfect. It asks us to be exact. Rosewood was here. People lived, worked, worshipped, argued, married, planted, and planned here. A map once refused to show it. We just did.